All right, we're going to continue a little bit more about what we were talking about last time. You remember what that was, don't you? Trying to cut down, as I know all of you are, on your amount of overt sarcasm to do foolish things like that. It's all right as long as you're doing a cheap, very cheap imitation of yourself. No need to look for material outside yourself. Or come to think about it, if someone actually had to look for material outside themselves, that is, to do a little sarcastic piece of business, I suddenly think, what a very teeny-weeny small self they would have. Well, either that or, of course, you'd be perfect. You got your choice. Which brings up another interesting possibility. The only person that could look at themselves and not have good fodder for a real good sarcastic little shtick would have to be somebody who was, what do you call it here on, perfect. Somebody just perfect, so that there could be no irony and hence no sarcasm, cynicism. Or else somebody whose self, you understand, was like a little BB. Just nice and bland, maybe painted battleship gray, just such a teeny nothing that even though you couldn't necessarily, if you're ordinary, call them perfect, you just say, well, there's nothing to be sarcastic about. But once I started this palaver, as always, all of you should do is make gestures like that toward your head when you're trying to do this. Because in the polarized world, anytime that something strikes you, and then it strikes you that, wait a minute, that brings up two additional possible strikes. There's always this possibility to consider that the bastards may be the same thing. You can always depend on this. They are closely, trust me, closely related. They are not strangers. So I bring that up, that if you could be perfect at the street level sense, I was just suggesting that there is a definite possible connection between that and being of almost no consequence. But back on to something more important, at least something reasonable, right? We were talking about, if you recall, how it is that the ordinary intellect, even when it is trying specifically, as it oftentimes does with not the heart of the bell curve of human intelligence, but life always has men standing up making these kinds of statements, wherein the intellect apparently is doing its foremost job to be objective, to be clear-minded, to be expansive, to be inclusive. And it does so by saying such things. Modern dress would be something like we'd already done, as stating from an institutional, professional view such as psychology or just running fast, ordinary person, conventional wisdom in the city, of saying we are all born into this great genetic code, this great piece of genetic structure that is humanity, and we all are what we are. We're all unique, and that all humans should be encouraged, or they should be free, but then perhaps even more so encouraged to be what they are. That in this multifarious garden with trees and plants, fungus, birds and bees and worms. In this great garden, all of us have a place, that all humans have their own individuality that is unique. They always love to say that. And that they should be encouraged along these pursuits, that tulips should be encouraged to be tulips. Petunias should be free to be petunias and should not have someone looking over their shoulder and saying, you would be much happier if you were a tulip. Or to tell a worm, you'd be much happier, you'd be a more fulfilled creature if you could fly like your brothers the birds. That is not the way to treat people. Now that would sound as though that you have the intellect working overtime, and that it is really saying something, is on the verge of saying something, is on the verge of freeing itself from the gravity of a polarized, driven, three-dimensional world. Except that is not the end of the observation. That is not the end of the episodic spurt of energy running through the human nervous system, as you all know. That is not the end of the statement. It is never the end of the statement. It cannot be the end of the observation. Because after saying all of that, the speaker, that is life, the speaker will say that men of all stripes, everyone in this great garden of life, as different as we are, as unique as we are in our interest, as singular as we are in our talents, as individual as we may be in some of our shortfalls. We should be free to pursue what we are, even encouraged to do so, except, of course, as the exercise of such freedom might hinder, might harm someone else's freedom, someone else's attempt to fully exercise what they are. Where we stopped the last time is, I assume since I pointed out that all of you can realize by now, that except is a tacitly expected, to say the least, conclusion to the episodic statement. And it is, by all ordinary sane intellects in the city, it is accepted sans analyzation as an intricate part of this statement about freedom, as this great attempted exposition on the singular nature of all of us. No one questions it. No one thinks about it because it is just so. It is an intricate part in the three-dimensional world of the statement, apparently, objectively, inclusively attempting to point out a certain kind of, they don't, of course, when they're speaking about freedom, the intellect does not want to talk about some form of initial captivity. And so it comes out in a more apparent verbal positive form that we are all born with unique qualities. We're all born, not all of us are born with a great singing voice. Not all of us are born with the ability to play the accordion. Not all of us are born with the talent to paint. If I keep on, I guess finally I get some talent that some of us have. Well, I can whistle good when nobody's around, and I can make rude noises with my armpit. But everyone accepts, nowadays, everyone accepts that there is, without any doubt, their nervous system is attuned to it and responds to the declaration that there is a singularity about us, a uniqueness that is not subject to, should not be subject to, should not be available for other humans to attempt to mutilate, to manhandle, to in some way say, well, listen, you should not be interested in playing the guitar or the accordion. What you should do is take up painting. Or you should not waste your time with any of the arts. It's simply the work of evil forces. You should be religious. That we should not be doing that to one another, institutionally or individually. You know, except, of course, that if whatever you're attempting to do is in some way harming someone else, is interfering with the freedom for them to pursue it. Now, this brings us about to where we were, believe it or not, for those of you with a memory. Now consider, though, without us wasting any time analyzing why that final statement must be true. At city level, it must be true, or it would not be an intricate part of the initial observation. As, well, your own intellect can see that if it can see anything, that has to be an inseparable, inherent part of the observation that in some way we're all unique and should not be subject to just the whims of prevailing culture, society, passing fads, that our own individuality should be sacrosanct and encouraged at least to the point that it begins to harm and hinder someone else's. But now notice, at the primary level, which is the mother's milk, even to artistes and intellectuals and people who repair concertinas. When you get to the basic level, please note this, that any creature's fully exercise of its freedom to be itself will violate, without any exception, some other creatures. A bird's freedom, nay, even responsibility to be itself, is going to violate the freedom of a worm when the fowl so naturally consumes it. It is not simply playing with words, as if you just walked in here for the first time, as strange as it might sound or unexpected, and it's not, of course, any observation that life is cruel. Life is cruel to sissies, but we don't go into that since so many people want to write and complain about the use of the word sissy. What's surprising is even several men who rebuild transmissions even wrote and complained about that, so we won't go back into that. Of course, any time the word is used, it is in quotation marks and spelled with a capital S. And normally, when I say it, it is in italic. So is that enough for you? But this is beyond what might appear to be any kind of metaphorical use of it. It is a hard fact that out in the garden of life, and life itself at the primary level, nothing right, nothing wrong, it's not a matter of justice, but it is the reality behind such words as freedom, as individual permission to pursue one's goals without harm to someone else. A bird, to pursue its birdness, has got to stay alive, and it's got to eat. And let us assume, amongst other of its, so I hear, apparent choices, it pulls up to the window and says, I would like a worm to go. Over at the Big Blue Jay Drive-In. But now look at it from another way. This is, without any doubt, it is a violation. It is, to say the very least, a hindrance to the worm's pursuit of any further wormness. Why is it then, I ask you, that you have this unentangleable, don't bother to look that one up, well, let's go find a cheap dictionary and write it in. This unentangleable. Why the unentangleable exception that must be an intricate part? The sentence is not complete. The episodic spurt of energy in the nervous system is not complete for any human, any sane human, any ordinary human to talk about freedom and how we should all be exercising and be allowed to pursue our own individual destinies, except, of course, nowadays you don't really have to fill it in, but you know the rest of it, except, of course, everybody, yeah. As long as I don't harm someone else. Why, when it reaches the secondary world of man, when I point out, and I assume that you do catch the gist of it, I didn't go into other examples, it's not just birds and worms, it's everything. It's the transfer of energy. Nothing at the primary level, at the silent, the non-cortical level, nothing can exercise its freedom. Dirt, trees, nothing can exercise its freedom without violating, without hindering, without coming into conflict with someone else's freedom, some other creature's freedom. That is the only way to transfer energy. So why does it become this unentangleable, incomprehensible? Is why it's just, as I said, it is unanalyzed, because you cannot analyze it. Isn't it? That's not unique, as you know by now, that one statement, but you have to say we should all be free to do what we want to and pursue our own ends, except, of course, insofar as it does not harm anybody else. You cannot analyze that any more than you can analyze any conclusive statement in the 3D world that's based on polarization, which they all are, because it is not conclusive. All you got to do is just take it 1 inch further, a couple of spaces further in the typesetting where you think was a period there, and if you can think at all by now, you know that that sentence will not hold up. And so you just have to take it. Ordinary people don't even question it. It just goes through and yeah. It's true. Anybody, if I say, wait a minute, that statement won't hold up, an ordinary person will say, if they thought about it a minute, they'll say, you're saying that the last part about except we shouldn't interfere, yeah. If I say, well, that won't hold up. The only thing they'd come up with, they say, are you serious? Well, yeah. And they think, well, you're some kind of undercover fascist, or, I mean, you're a madman. You can't go around and harm other people just to pursue your own ends. We'd all be done for. We'd kill each other, and nobody would have any freedom, and et cetera. And so then I could say, if I was so dumb to talk to somebody like that, I could say, well, wait a minute. Go back to the first part of the sentence. Then what you're saying, the first part of the sentence won't fly. You know, you're crazy, they'd say to me, as they should. But I ask you, not them. When this is, if you are following it, an absolute certainty, it is a tacit, unrecognized, inescapable, manifold certainty that the exercise of so-called freedom, the exercise to be oneself if one is a pine tree, if one is a butterfly, if one is a worm, if one is a raccoon, it will, to exercise this raccoonness, this treeness, this singularity of oneself, it will, without any question, hinder, harm, absolutely, ultimately violate some other things, freedom to be itself. And of course, not to give you the blues, but eventually, I fear that you too shall be violated. In case, write it, your final words if you want to say a word for justice. So wait a minute. You can if you want to. And then now that I think about it and see if perhaps everything goes, what? That's for those of you that don't want to die. Why is it when it reaches the secondary level that this is, I'll do it one more time then we'll forget it, unentangable perception here regarding man's secondary, intellectual, describable world? When you can see instantly, we'll assume, that it's true down at the garden, at a strictly physical, at a strictly primary level, that it's true. There can't be no freedom without violating somebody else's freedom, to use those terms. And then jump right up here, and it says, no, it's not true. When it's got to be true. The basis of it's true. The trunk, the roots are true. So an apple tree is not going to produce, as you know, prunes. In the secondary world, the idea that there is an exception, that we should all pursue being what we are, blah, 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 birds should be birds, or blah, 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 except, of course, and then intellect to me go, oh, yeah. From whence cometh this? Yeah. From whence cometh this absolute, unquestioned acceptance that there is one exception? I mean, there's no way out. That everybody should be free to be themselves, except insofar as their freedom begins to harm somebody. Well, yeah. Oh, sure, I know that. May I suggest that in the intellect, to use a very broad, loose term, men are made to dream that there are exceptions to the dog-eat-dog world, which is simply the primary world, that energy must be transferred. Men dream that there are exceptions to this dog-eat-dog. I just use that as no pejorative sense. That's just the way life is. Or bird-eat-worm. Man has got to dream intellectually, that is, in the secondary world. his own secondary world, that there are exceptions to this. Because if he did not, the intellect would not entertain the idea, much less strive for, tomorrow. Would you? Would any intellect? You don't have to worry about the primary, since we can't talk about it except artificially. But if you suddenly cut off all of your secondary aspects and your ideas about what is justice and what is freedom in life, and assume that you still, everything still being equal, that you would still operate as a functional human being without that, then that would have no effect on you. You would still eat when you were hungry, and you would take food from other people. If you could get by with it, if you're hungry enough, you'd do it and then suffer the consequences later, and et cetera. That kind of silent primary life. But, and of course at that level, there are no dreams of tomorrow. But now move to the secondary world, the intellectual life of man. Would you strive in any way? Would you get up and go to work? Would you do all the things that an ordinary person does because they have to, or because you find it tolerable, or because you just can't find any way out? Would you do any of them if the absolute unconditional reality of, yes, this is a great garden, and there are worms, and there are birds, and there are raccoons, and there are cats, and ultimately, cats eat birds, birds eat worms, worms eat each other, worms eat dirt, dirt eats us. If the intellect was made to operate on that basis, do I have to point out that your intellect, tomorrow when the alarm went off for work, your intellect would have no interest in getting up. And if your intellect had no interest in getting up and going up to work at Burger Doodle and putting on your uniform, let's assume that you're not real hungry. It's just 5:15, it's time to get up, and your intellect is now the proud, continual possessor of the awareness that, yes, we're all free to be ourselves, and part of that freedom is to be violated. That our freedom will be consumed by someone else's freedom. May I suggest to you that your intellect would, if it, in fact, in some way it was implanted in you tonight, and the alarm went off at 5:15, you looked up. I hope Burger Doodle's day's growth is not dependent upon you, because they have seen the last of you. You would not work for tomorrow. There would be no sense of, well, boy, I hate this job, and it's 5:15, and it's Saturday. Everybody else is, why have I got to work? And then, of course, you realize, well, I got to work because I got that, phony baloney American, quote, sports car, or I got these bills, I got my MasterCard, and so you get up. But it's on the basis that there is an operational tomorrow wherein this freedom can be even possibly, the potential's there, can even possibly expand. No continuing awareness that my freedom, as it is, will be, my freedom will be somebody else's meal tomorrow. My freedom will be somebody's hors d'oeuvre. There would be no striving here for tomorrow. And if it were not for here, if we're talking about primary, if man was not an intellectual creature, he would not be striving for tomorrow any more than your dog or cat would. Since somebody reported that tonight was toward the end of the week, how about let's be even more? If you think that was, how about let's be even more? They agreed. In the polarized 3D world, as man's two-dimensional, as man's secondary world perceives it, in this world, not only is this an accepted fact, I'm going to take it from the great world of physics, not only is it true that two things cannot occupy the same space, beyond that, there is an unseen area, again, of funny physics, six-dimensional physics. Not only can two things not occupy the same space, all two things, all areas of polarized existence, they are inherently intended not to do so. Specifically, a bird and a worm cannot occupy the same space. Truth and error, truth and falsity cannot occupy the same space. But now, as far as the 3D world has ever gotten with the intellect, is that kind of law, which I am using because it is a good aftershock of something else, but of saying, well, it's obvious. And at one time, it supposedly wasn't obvious, if you're going to believe history. Okay. That someone finally had to formulate that two objects, two things, cannot occupy the same space. It is a violation of reality. It's a violation of physical law. It can even be mathematically proven. And so everyone who's even finished high school physics has heard that, and you know, and it's just obvious. You would think that it is a self-obvious reality without it even having to be formalized and codified in a physics book. But two things cannot occupy the same space. There is a six-dimensional, indescribable operation going on, of which this is an aftershock. Because not only is that true here, that two things can't, it's more than that. And there's no way to describe it. I already said it, and not many of you fell out and had a vision, so I'm going to say it again. Not only can they not, now I know this doesn't sound a lot, but trust me. Of course, don't trust me, but remember it. Okay. Not only can they not, they are inherently intended not to. I know. Zeta doesn't sound like it added anything, but it did. See, it's not simply that a bird and a worm, a cat and a bird. It is not simply that you cannot take the cat and put it in a space here, that if we measured it three-dimensional, I described that on some kind of geometric axis, that here is the cat. And there's no way that a bird, any bird, a paradigm of a bird, are a bookcase. But let's just use a bird and a cat came to me. They cannot occupy the same space. Right? Yeah, that's obvious. But they're not intended to. Yeah, I know you said that. They're not intended to. You know? I mean, the sentence makes sense, but what the hell does it mean? Well, what can you say besides saying two things cannot occupy the same space? They're not intended to. Well, could I ask this? Does this have anything to do with what we started out talking about? I thought you'd never ask. But I thought you'd never answer. They're not intended. And if you get any glimpse of this, then this whole three-dimensional idea, this intellectual idea of freedom, takes on a different spin, assuming that your intellect can move about. Let's try it this way, physically. Take it back to just a good garden level, street level variety of a description. Two objects, a bird and a cat, a bird and a worm, are not only cannot occupy the same space, they're not intended to. And another slight subversive way to approach it, may I suggest, would be this, to realize that at the quiet, primary, physical level, the birds compete for space. The birds, now can we shift the sentence just a bit? The birds compete for food. I'm just using the everyday term, quite acceptable in biology, zoology, conventional wisdom. Birds are competing, this bird here is competing with other birds. Birds over there and birds occupying those spaces for food. Birds are competing even with cats, a certain kind of foods that could be laid out. Birds are competing even with worms. Gets down to a very desperate level of eating, and there are certain organic substances that birds and worms both could consume. So you have any given creature, any given thing that is occupying space. It is inherently wired up in the paradigm of life via man to not occupy the space, a space that something else is occupying. But another way to look at this three-dimensional aftershock that is expressed as an inability, an impossibility of one thing occupying the same space as another, look at this as being another description, this kind of subversive operational synonym, but look at it as being another variation, another way to say they are in competition. You certainly, which ordinary intelligence would do, already does, would say, well, that's two different things. They may or may not be in connection, but they're two different things. But you can see them as being an expression at a more simplistic level, three-dimensional level, see them as being an expression, an aftershock of something else. Why can't they occupy the same space? And forget about the laws of physics in a three-dimensional world, because that's just child's play. Think about another. What could be behind this? What if they could occupy the same space? A starving bird could then light on a worm and never know it. Or a cat wander out starving and look around and just plop down and sit on top of a bird, never know it, the bird not know it, and they could occupy the same space. And if they did, there'd be no competition for space, for food. Now, past birds and cats and etc. But anybody care to consider the higher neural ends of the nervous system and to such secondary backyard creatures as ideas, concepts, ideals? Do they not compete for space? You've got your choice. You can take any sort of civilized, learned, sophisticated, or retro-sophisticated, whatever the hell. Put that in the dictionary along with unentangleable. You can look upon institutional warfares. The old one was always, well, they're fighting over land. They're fighting over basic foodstuffs. They're fighting over mineral rights, which is still not an improbability. But then there seems to be, from certain views of life via man's intellect, there seems to be other conflicts even more despicable, horrendous. That is, conflicts over ideas, religious conflicts, political conflicts, conflicts over economic theories. Not actual fights over land, but two groups of people standing there hollering, capitalist, capitalist now, capitalist forever. And across there is people saying, communism, the wave of the future. And they look like they're about to fire up their guns, and you're an outside observer, and you ask somebody, what's the boundary line? What are they fighting over? You mean like territory or property? Yeah. Oh, nothing. Well, I mean, there's probably some argument there over the boundary I see drawn. Oh, no, they never even mentioned that. Well, what are they about to go to war for? Weren't you listening? Where are you from? Some other planet? They're fighting over. I heard those words. They're fighting over. Yeah, but what are they? What is capitalism? You must be from out of town. And of course, you cannot sit there and laugh unless you understand what you're doing, and then it is real cute. But if all of you had that kind of sense of humor, we would be out with a tent on the road. Pack up that B3 and get us to go load us sawdust, and we'd be out having fun. Even let him bring his accordion. It is not that that isn't some form of insanity, because more and more you could look at it as being a sign of sophistication, a sign of being modern, or as they say in Mississippi, modern. That you have two groups of people ready to do combat, and if they are really out of step, if they are retro, as still goes on this planet today, you've got people fighting over a lake somewhere, a river somewhere, or you got some group fighting over, well, wait a minute, that used to be our territory. They do fight over that. It's not better or worse, but nowadays, what kinds of people, look at it from your view, all of you people are seeing right here on the avant-garde of city evolution. You look upon that, which is proper. Insofar as city views are concerned, those people still fighting over land. Those people still fighting over, well, our grandfather's generation used to own that mountain over there, and you people took it. We want it back. And by God, and they're rattling, nowadays not necessarily spears and sabers, but sometimes they are. But even if they're rattling modern technology, they're wielding it with very outdated hands and ideas. Vis-a-vis, people fighting over, actively or otherwise, but people prepared to fight over ideologies. It is simply a fact that nowadays, and it's always been a relative fact throughout the history of man as long as he could speak, that those less driven by the higher end of the nervous system are most likely to be, of course, living a life based upon more closer to a primary level, but then their warfares, their conflicts will also be based on such. And those who just quite mechanically, not better, they're not more intelligent, but they are more civilized, they are more driven by the intellect at that level than the former group. Those that are more civilized, the more you get into the advanced technological area of this planet, they will be less likely fighting over absolute territory as prepared to fight over this. That's just a sign. It's not analyzed that way as far as I know in the city. If it was, it wouldn't amount to much, because people would hear it and go, so what? Now that you mentioned it, that's obvious as hell. We could call ourselves, we go, Professor Obvious. Thank you. But here is what's not obvious. What is going on with these conflicts beyond the two-dimensional, the polarized three-dimensional world between communism, capitalism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever it is? What is actually going on? Now, if you can think, of course, you know that it's something far beyond, it's not even worth talking about, that, wait, there is something. There is a real conflict. Do not pass it by, Professor Obvious. There is a quite inherent conflict between, fill in the blanks, communism and capitalism, between Hinduism and Islam. Wouldn't that be something else, right? It'd be people that, we want chocolate, another group wants vanilla. What is it? It's no longer now a cat and a bird fighting for the same space, competing for the same space. It is now what? It is cats, birds, and worms of the secondary domain fighting over space. And they got no choice. It's not a matter of, well, someday communism will come around and be more like capitalism. Maybe yes, maybe no. If it does, one of them will disappear. Or maybe one day, the great faiths of Buddhism will be more in line as it should have been originally with the common motherhood of the great Hindu teachings. Maybe yes, maybe no. It's irrelevant. You might as well be saying, as some pretty crude philosophers have been driven to say that someday cats and birds will no longer be in conflict. That's true, but if that day ever happens, it'll be the day, to use that example, that the cats have eaten all of the birds. Then there'll be no one saying, my, how unjust it is that the cats keep violating the freedom of birds. That would be the day, and say that's just another blank, 2 blanks. That would be the day that Islam and Judaism no longer have any conflict. That'll be the day that one of them has eaten the other one up. That'll be the day when capitalism has consumed all the communists in the world. There's not one communist left. Wait a minute, you look a little pink around the edges. Nah, I was just taking some Pepto-Bismol that got in my mouth. Oh, all right. You look around, there are no communists left, and to say, well, it's the triumph of capitalism. All the cats ate all the birds. There is no longer any competition in that one area. But other than that, there is competition, which is a human word. I just used it because it is readily available. And it has, as you and I both know, all sorts of street-level connotations. But I'm just pointing out to you that it is competition to occupy the same space. And eventually, a cat and a bird are going to occupy the same space. Eventually, capitalism, communism. Eventually, your opinion about what's right and somebody else's opinion about what's right are going to try and occupy the same space. And it may result in your fist trying to occupy the same space as that other person's jaw, or vice versa. And if you get really good, then up here, there is the passing, hardly noticed attempt for this to occur up here. And I say hardly noticed. At times when it's noticed real distinctly, because they normally call in people with coats and they get down your name and they wrap you up real tight, maybe put you in ice and take you behind door number 3. Wherein the only prize is you do not have to tie your shoes. You do not have to shave yourself. Everything in the secondary world has got to compete in the same way that everything in the primary world competes. And if there were, in the world of man, the unique secondary world of man, the intellectual creature, if there were prevailing absolutes, if there were ideas, if there were maps, if there were truisms, such as we should all be free to do what we want to, except if there were some sort of prevailing, overriding absolutes, that is, things that would have no exceptions, statements, ideas, maps, that you could make a statement that we should all be free to do exactly what we want to do, birds be birds, worms be worms, trees be trees. Thank you, that's all I have to say. And the world goes, wow, if there were to be such, that is, it follows with no exception, that there would be such that had no exception, then could I entice you to ponder this? If everyone would take your chin firmly between your thumb and finger and go. If there were such absolutes, what you would have would be ideas, episodic energy bursts called ideas, concepts, and etc., that would be so flabby, so inbred. I mean, they would make that banjo-playing kid in Deliverance look like a chemistry professor. But the ideas and the concepts would be so inbred, they would be so passive that they would be unusable. And why would this be? It would be because if there were prevailing ideas, if there were things that could be said and thought that had no exception at the end of the sentence, do you understand why they would be weak? Why would they would be unusable? Because they would then have that would be freed from the demand of having to compete for space. Now, I'll admit beforehand, if you want to, the few minutes we got, that this gets tricky. But if you guys kind of downbrain it all, screw it. Listen. It's the very thing that the intellect is driven to believe it's after. Scientifically and philosophically. And you people fit right in. Anybody interested in this kind of stuff, thing. That yes, what I want is to actually get down to business and quit beating around the bush. Or even the Reagan. I want somebody to tell me what's what. People believe that scientifically. They believe that's what the Institute of Science is about. People believe that that is what the drive of man's intellect is about. To get to the ultimate truth. Or at least some truth on which we can depend. If there were, in the three-dimensional, polarized world of man, which is all the ordinary intellect can conceive of, if there were some sort of actual, unconditional, without exceptions, we'll have to put it, but everybody believes this is possible, ordinary intellect, truth. If there were some that, in the 3D sense, in a polarized world, that there was, or were, if you want it plural or singular, but let's say at least a truth, that there was no exception, no end of the sentence, it itself would be the absolute paradigm of weakness. And that doesn't begin to cover it. It would be the supreme example of impotence. To see, I know it sounds tricky because it sounds like an absolute contradiction. That the truth, I mean, every religion says this, and every ordinary intellect is not even religious would say it. That, hey, you are on terrible shaky ground now because the truth would be the ultimate power. That if there is a truth, now I'm not saying there is, says an ordinary intelligence, but if there is, which I suspect, if there is, what you just said is just falderoy. I beg your pardon. This is just foolishness. Because the truth would be the supreme power. Tut tut. If there was such a thing as an unconditional, absolute truth of any nature in the 3D confines. See, I know this sounds absolutely impossible, but if there were, it would be so weak, it would collapse. It would be absolutely useless. Why? If you had such an absolute, what you would have is a kind of untempered and uncontested dominance of a force with no opposing force. If that could exist, if you had a ruling power in the garden, in your intellect, you would have a ruling power with no loyal opposition. The government will collapse. If you've got any sort of eye at all, this is not to prove the point because it doesn't prove it. These are three-dimensional aftershocks, but historically, surely probably in the city somebody has noticed this. They didn't make anything out of it. But think about it. Absolute, as close as they can get, tyrannies. Some group of people, and let's take it right quick back to a good, tangible, apparently out there example. You've got a garden somewhere, an orchard, an empire, a part of life's body in man, via man, wherein a group of people seem to be absolutely, totally, unconditionally dominated by a tyrant. He is it, no exceptions, as close as possible. Everyone knows, or you should know, that is a dying area of life's body. It produces nothing. It never produces art. They make no technological advances, and et cetera, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah. It also cannot survive. You know, this or Haiti or any group somewhere, he may hold them for 50 years. the situation we're in, and of course it's not absolute, but I'm trying to give you a hard, tangible example. We're in this almost an absolute going on. And of course, I changed it from being like an absolute freedom or an absolute truth, but all absolutes in the 3D world, you just, only ordinary intelligence would think there's some difference between a Joseph Stalin and the truth, or a bird and Papa Doc. Anything that, the closer it approaches to being an unconditional, dominating power, dominating force, the closer it gets to it, the more, I can assure you, it's just a fact. It's just not recognized, it's not taken into consideration, because it would help destroy the illusion of tomorrow and change. But it is already harboring its own destruction. Of course, everything is, but this one specifically is. Because you could not have, it simply cannot exist three-dimensionally, so we're talking in a relative sense. But you could not have an uncontested power. And the closer you get to it, the more destructive it is to itself. That is, the closer it gets, the cats get so fast, so sharp, that for years, I mean, it's been a running battle. I mean, the birds screw faster than cats can eat them. They just got birds everywhere. And plus, birds are not dummies. If the cats got to the point that they could become like this whole mass of Neros, or Titos, or Generalissimo Franco. That is, the cats get to the point of being almost an uncontested, dominating force. The truth, what's going to happen? Now let's say in a polarized world that the diet of cats is, you got to go along with this, is limited to birds. If the cats reach getting close, which is impossible, but getting close like three-dimensionally, like to discuss getting close to the speed of light, and they say you can't. There can be no absolute, unconditional, absolute force, truth, power, freedom, because the closer you get, the cats are getting close to being an ultimate force. They're getting close to being, in the confines of what we're talking about, they're getting to the point of being their own ultimate freedom, the supreme freedom that we're going to be cats and nothing will hold us back. We're now getting faster. Maybe they even learn to fly a little bit. They're getting to the point that they're about to be an unconditional, dominating force of the birds. The closer they get to it, if they actually got to it, what would happen? They would eat all the birds on this planet. The birds would be gone. That was their only diet. What's happened? It's a fact. The cats would have committed suicide. Of course, they wouldn't have. His life extincted the cats after it did the birds. There can be no such thing, not for any sort of religious, not for any philosophical, but for spatial reasons, physical reasons. There can be no absolute. There can be no freedom. There can be no statement. There can be no idea. Those of you that are trying to keep track, notice we are on the same track where we started tonight. There cannot be a statement, a concept, an idea such as we're all individuals, we're not born an exact replica of some other human, and therefore we should be free to pursue our own destinies. Except not to interfere with somebody else. I knew that, yeah. If you're looking for an exception to that, picture a world, or some section of the world, wherein the cats gained such dominance that they consumed, they wiped out, they overpowered their diet. They overpowered the loyal opposition. They totally consumed an opposing power. It is suicide. That's why it cannot happen. That is why, from one verbal, albeit tricky view of trying to show you, that is why there cannot be any concept saying, well, people should do what they want to do. People should be what they want to be. An idea, a religion, an institutional theory, a concept. This is the one. I say it's the one. The majority of us say it. All of us cats say this is it. Why can't the birds see reason? Why can't the birds wake up and quit being Hindus, or quit being Italian, or quit being short? Quit parting your hairs in the middle, you naughty, stupid little birds. Why don't you give in and dance forever with us cats as close as possible, and we'll eat your little heads off. That is, we'll show you the light. The idea that truth, some way, truth, justice, freedom, all that, but truth, some way is finally going to take all the darkness, all the stupidity, the ignorance, the fallacies of men's minds and ideas. And that some way, if we can just get all this ignorance in the world and get up real close to the truth, because many people have said the truth is warming, the truth is like a light in the darkness, the truth is like the sun, the truth should be the center of the universe. The truth is when your brain feels, nice and toasty when I find the truth. What we should want to do as right thinking, sophisticated men and women is to encourage all the ignorance to come on in. Come on in here where we can deal with you, all you prejudice and you stupidity. Come on in here and dance with the truth. Get up close, by God, and come to your senses. Get enough of those dumb birds up close to the cats, and the cats will eat them all up. And then the cats can look around and ask, in that magnificent ballroom, who is to say that the truth, the truth, who is to say that we were wrong now that we show that the truth is incontrovertible, the truth is without reasonable resistance? And sure enough, they're right. And we could all salute the cats just as, as they all dropped dead from starvation. Due to our time, I'm just going to have to stop it here and point out to you, though, that thus it becomes, thus it always is, that even when the intellect, anybody's, it's not a pick on some flawed individual, the best that the intellect can do at street level, to be objective, to try and speak of freedom, to try and open up all possible vistas, all of it ends the sentence with a comma, except. Because if there was some absolute of anything, and I admit I skipped around a good bit, an absolute apple, an absolute truth, an absolute bird, a supreme freedom, if there was anything that was absolute, that had no opposition, you understand why I said that when I originally said it would be a paradigm of weakness, and I said that didn't cover it. It's more than weakness. It would have, it didn't have any choice, but if it could exist, it would be suicidal. It would not be the supreme strength. I might point out to you that that is why, or one reason that many of the great ideas are only remembered in books. And that you read that this idea at one time, by all reports, moved thousands, millions of people, and now you read it and it's like a dusty, just vaguely interesting historical footnote. Or, of course, to really be dirty, how about all the great ideas that you've had in your lifetime? Things that, by God, tomorrow, as soon as I get up, as soon as these bennies get out of my system and I'm get over this hangover, there's no doubt I'm going back to school and become a hairstylist like I always wanted to. All of the great dreams, all the great ideas, where'd they go? Bye.